Good evening, students. So this is just a preface to what we will soon be learning in class. But I just wanted to give you a heads up and some kind of like a pre-game, so you could have this information before we come to class, or you cannot. But if you decide to utilize this resource, that would be awesome sauce. So within the next learning lab, we will discuss historical context, which as a historian is incredibly important in such an amazing school. History, pretty much since the beginning of time, like as a student, has always been kind of a burden. I've heard from not only my students but all my colleagues when I was studying history and asking them what they thought. Everybody hated it. But I think how historians work is such a underestimated skill, and you know it is just amazing how historians put things together. We don't get much from a history standpoint. We only get bits and pieces, primary sources, secondary sources. That's all we get. And so it's up to us as historians to then take that, think about it, digest it, regurgitate our own interpretation of what we think happened, why it happened, what caused it, what were the effects, blah, blah, blah. Which, goes against the whole history is just dates and names, which has been taught in schools, which I don't agree with, but I think it's more on a personal basis, because history hits everybody. We all connect with one sort of history. But anyway, that's what this will be going to. As you can see, this learning lab is brought to us not only by the Smithsonian Museum, which is the website I'm getting this off of, but the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Modified fairly recently, which is really cool. As a description, I'm just going to read this. Historical thinking skills allow historians to better practice and interpret history, we need a historical context to do. This series teaches students how to develop these skills to become better historians themselves. Within this learning lab, we will guide students into the process of defining historical contents, and then in practicing employ these strategies into different historical contexts, into different historical events that we may relate with more. With the example that we will be talking about today is the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. Historical context is the background information that informs the deeper understanding of a historical individual, group, or event. As stated, we only get so much from these individuals or groups or events that we are the last piece of the puzzle to then interpret what we think why these happened. Historical context is important because it allows historians to better understand history in ways a historical individual or group understood the world around them. We take what we see. We think about what were these people thinking at this point in time? Why did they do this? Why did they take that picture? This is what historians do. We just think about this and we put it together using the data that we collect, which is historical data, not numerical data, like math. It's more fun. These are the standards that I'm supposed to be teaching you. One of them is classify all kinds of historical sources in a secondary interpretation. As we've talked about in class, and as we should know by now, we have two different types of history sources. We have primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are like eyewitness reports and or diaries and or newspapers of what happened during the event. Something that we could definitely say, this is fact. This is what this person said. This is what these person did and such. Then we have secondary sources, which is what we do all the time with the papers you write, with the sources that you read. These are secondary sources. This is what historians do. Secondary sources are what historians, interpret and put that last piece in. You also evaluate the relative influence of varied causes and events and developments of the past. Again, taking what we see from history, taking what we see from the past, and understanding it, which goes into the first, then to the second standard of determine the kinds of sources that will be helpful in answering compelling and supporting questions, taking into considering multiple points of views represented in the sources. As I said, sometimes we're given so much that it's hard to condense, and then sometimes we're given not enough. When we are given too much, we need to take in the different perspectives that these people have, the different perspectives of the different primary sources that we find. And then when we don't have enough, we need to then still take into account the perspectives that we don't see. Like what if, a person of this thought about this instead of like this person thinking about this. It's so much, and I love it. I love history. So without further ado, I say let's get on it. Pitter patter.